They pried the emergency door, and the earth exhaled a sour, wet breath that had been waiting for decades. My light caught the row's first empty seats, a pink lunchbox scuffed white along the hinge, and a class list taped to the dash in cheerful ink. Over the names, someone had pressed a thick red line and left 5 words that never stopped echoing. We never made it to Morning Lake. Let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. I keep my mornings quiet. Coffee at the stove until it just begins to steam boots by the door, radio on low, so I can hear the freight line across the river when it wakes. In the spring, Hallstead County smells like damp cedar and gasoline, the sort of air that gets under your shirt and clings. Most days, I step off the front stoop and scan the same small strip of street I've been watching since I was a teenager, 3 mailboxes tilted at different angles. A live oak that dropped its heavy limbs during the '98 ice storm, and the Kelly's front walk, now 2 inches lower along the center from decades of footsteps, and 1 summer of drought. The town sits in a shallow bowl, a ring of pines holding us like a hand. Morning Lake glints out their silver when the wind picks up, and darker when it goes still. 39 years ago, it was where our 5th graders went to see how a beaver dam works and learn the names of birds that only pass through in May. You could hear the bus before you saw it, the rattle as it turned off the main road, the squeak of brakes that needed the shop, the chorus of plastic backpack buckles clacking like wind chimes. In 1986, I was 9 a week into chicken pox, and the doctor had told my mother I wasn't setting foot in a school or a bus for 10 days. I had pressed my face to the bedroom window and watched my world roll away without me. Our block was slow, good kind of slow. Porch lights flicked off with the weather report. Mr. Nguyen watered his tomatoes before the temperature rose past 80. The principal's Plymouth passed the playground at 7:20 on the dot, same route, same wave. If you slept with your window open, you could count your day by sound. The paper hitting the driveway. The screen door on Sandra Jean's house, where her dad left for the refinery, the commuter bus sighing to a stop 2 blocks down, and the band of grackles that squabbled on the Kelly's big elm before breakfast. People lived in the same houses so long their yards started to look like them, practical shrubs, patient lawns, 1 or 2 impulsive decisions planted near the fence. Nora Kelly lived 2 houses south, a slip of a girl with green eyes and a stubborn swing of her hair when she ran. She would leave a chalk hopscotch on our curb so bright you could see it from the corner store, and somehow the lines stayed straight, even on the cracked concrete. On Saturdays, her mom set a pitcher of tea on their porch, and we'd split popsicles and watch the older kids wheel down the street on 10 speeds, all elbows and knees and scraped palms. Nora gave names to things: corner cats, mailboxes, the pine that leaned like it was listening, and those names stuck if she used them enough. Kimmy Leong sat 1 row back from me in school. Her backpack was always too heavy, and she'd tug the straps forward like a tugboat and grin when I offered to carry it. Kimmy scratched her name into anything she was afraid of losing pencil tape dispenser inside of her shoe. When she got a purple bracelet at the fall festival, the cheap plastic kind that closes with a little snap, she etched KIMI in the band with a safety pin, working the letters until they bit. She said it made her feel like the world would have a harder time misplacing her. We had a teacher that spring everyone liked. Miss Delaney was the kind of 20-something who could keep 30 kids quiet without raising her voice. She brought a portable record player for indoor recess and let us vote for the song. At the back of the room, she thumbtacked a calendar with big clean squares and wrote "Field Trip Morning Lake" across May 19th with a double underline. We talked about it for weeks. Who'd sit where, which trail had the best shade, whether the new camp had real cabins or just canvas on frames, and if we'd be allowed to take the little metal boats out if the wind stayed calm. I remember the phone call more than the conversation. My mother spelling it out, not looking at me while she said it like the words were going to sting twice if we made eye contact. "You're not going, baby." She put her hand on my forehead and said I was warm. I said I'd be cold by Monday. She laughed and shook her head soft and tired the way parents laugh when the decision is already made. Sunday night, she set a glass of ginger ale next to my bed, rolled a washcloth in ice, and kissed my temple. You can wave from the window when the bus goes by. I fell asleep counting the bumps along the plaster ceiling, promising myself I'd save half a popsicle for Nora when she got back. There were things that made sense at the time because adults said them and because we were 9. We were told the school bus would be a different color on Monday because ours needed new brake shoes, that the regular driver's wife had a doctor's appointment, and a sub would take the wheel. Mr. Davis, the name on a notice taped to the glass by the front office printed in block letters. I didn't think about it until later, but the tape felt fresh, not the way you see on Friday afternoon notices that curl by Monday. Somebody put that paper up early before the secretaries had started the coffee. We were also told Miss Delaney had called in sick, and the sub would meet the class on the bus. M. Atwell, I read it off the lobby clipboard when my mother walked me in to drop an excuse note. It was 7:40. 2 teachers were arguing softly near the supply closet about whether the nature trail was open after last week's rain. Mrs. Guzman whispered that the wooden footbridge might be slick. The principal pushed open his office door and leaned out to say they'd posted a safety notice already, and then his voice dropped back to the tone grown-ups use when they think kids aren't listening. I remember the weather better than I should. Fog rolled across the 2-lane like it was being poured from a pitcher, not a heavy blanket, but the thin kind that drifts and reforms. It sat low just above the crown of the road and slid its cool fingers under porch-light halos and along the church parking lot stripe. If you drove with your low beams, the world narrowed to a good 20 feet of moistened air and a bell of light. If you drove with highs, you got glare back and a neon white wall. People in Hallstead prided themselves on knowing how to drive in anything dust, ice, fog, and the 2 weeks in summer when the heat shimmers make the highway look like it's bending. Mondays are slow everywhere, but that Monday moved carefully. Front doors opened. Someone set a thermos on a truck bed. A pair of teenagers tried to light a cigarette and botched it twice in the wind that seemed to come from nowhere. From my window, I watched as the first bus came and went with the high school band. Then the special ed van turned the corner, Ms. Harper at the wheel, her hair in a scarf. After that, the elementary buses rattled by one, carrying those stomp drum afternoons that sound like sneakers and milk cartons, and the thwack of a 4-square ball. When the lake bus turned down our street, it looked clean. The yellow, not faded like ours, but bright and a touch glossy as if it had rolled straight out of the wash. I could hear the big door fold open and the driver call mornin' with a voice that didn't carry much of our town in it. Windows flapped down halfway. A hand stuck out and flicked a paper football against the breeze. Nora stepped into view and turned to look up at my window, like maybe I'd break the rules at the last second and climb aboard. She lifted her fist, red ribbon tucked at the wrist, and made a little runner's pump at me tomorrow. I thumped the pain back and nodded tomorrow. The bus puffed a diesel sigh, a sound that means departure in any county. It wobbled forward with the usual shiver, just enough to jiggle the kids' heads like laughter moves water. I saw the white square of a clipboard in the front Miss Delaney's calendar edge peeking from under someone else's elbow. On our block, folks come out to wave at kids, even if they don't have one on board, because that's what you do in Texas when the city is a long way off, and you still take pride in your little corner of the map. Mrs. Kelly raised her dish towel the way she always did when her hands were full. Mr. Ramos tapped his mailbox and nodded at the driver as the bus rolled past. I tracked the bright rectangle of it until the fog swallowed its taillights like a mouth closing after a polite bite. At 9, you don't have the words for watchfulness. You have the feeling. That morning, our block kept itself clean and ordinary trash cans rolled back against fences. Dog water bowls topped off before the heat. But something about the quiet between sounds lingered a little too long. The bell at St. Agnes hit 9 o'clock, and then the space after it thinned out like the town waited for a reply. The refinery whistle on the far edge of the county announced shift change at 10, and the sound drifted across the pines with a tired ache. My mother rinsed grapes at the sink and turned the radio up to catch the farm report. I lay on the couch blanket to my chin and counted the seconds between the announcer's sentences. Even then, it felt like a pause had opened up big enough to see. You learn a place by its routines. The office secretary called the cafeteria at 9:30 to confirm headcount for lunch trays. The long-distance ring at the sheriff's desk, 2 short, 1 long, came at 9:40 when the state lab wanted to warn us about a phone outage in the next county. The crossing guard at Pine and 3rd waved a slow sign like he was a metronome. By mid-morning, the fog thinned to a pearl sheen that made the blacktop shine. The sun found the tops of the pines and turned them the color of sweet tea. All the regular noises came back in order a ladder clanked against the side of Garcia's body shop. The post office cart rattled over the broken tile at the door, and Mrs. Vaughn's terrier barked 3 times at the same squirrel that tormented it every weekday. I walked out to our front steps in socks and sat careful not to pick at the scabs along my wrist, where the itching was worst. A breeze came through and pressed the smell of lake water against the back of my throat clean at first, and then green the way shore edges smell when it's been a wet spring. From where I sat, you couldn't see the 2-lane after it dipped behind the church, but you could hear it if a truck downshifted to take that bend. When the wind slacked, another sound slid in from far off, thin but clear, a single whistle you could mistake for a train if you didn't know the logging spur closed years ago. The adults said it was the mill's pressure valve. Kids said it was the lake telling secrets. I didn't buy either that day. The tone of it was wrong, warmer, and more deliberate, like a man making a note through his teeth. Back then, I'd mark the time by the hardware store's radio. The noon farm prices came on a little after 11:30 because the owner liked to get ahead of lunch. He'd lean against the doorway with a styrofoam cup of black coffee, and if you walked by, he'd tip it toward you without taking his eyes off a sky he pretended to read. On May 19th, the radio caught static in the middle of the steer report. You could hear it trying to grab hold of the signal, that harsh scrape like a sweater snagging on a nail before it locked back in place. The owner tapped the dial once slow. I watched him from the curb and felt a curl in my stomach that I didn't know how to name. My mother ironed in the front room, careful with the steam, and set the shirt cuffs in a neat row that made her proud. She said the bus would be back before dinner, that the camp served hot dogs if the weather stayed good, and the kids washed up their hands. She set the porch light to the early timer anyway, an old habit from when my father worked swing shift. The timer clicked once, a soft plastic sound that always made me think of a throat clearing before a speech. Hallstead is the kind of county where people wave when they pass you and honk as they turn at the feed store. It's polite and predictable, the 2 qualities that keep an old place steady. You can plan your day around the regulars and still have time to fix a flat for a stranger. I became a cop because I like it that way. Most trouble answers to a polite knock and a second question asked a little slower. I still believe in that order. I still believe most people do the right thing when you hand them the chance. That afternoon in 1986, I lay back on the couch with the fan ticking and mapped the route in my head the same way I do now when I'm working a missing vehicle out of the school lot left at the bleachers over the dip at Mill Creek, past the old ranger station, then the last stretch where the pines grow close and the asphalt narrows to 2 tight lanes. I pictured the cabin roofs catching the sun, the dock lining up with the edge of the camp road, and the bus settling into its spot with the practiced sigh of something that knows where it's meant to be. Toward evening, the heat leaked out of the day in slow inches. A cloud bank parked itself above the far ridge, the kind that turns the air still and makes you taste rain that doesn't arrive. Someone down the street started a grill, and the smell of lighter fluid lifted like a memory you can't place. The church bell took its 5 o'clock swing and then stilled, and the block fell into that soft quiet when suppers close and radios go low. My mother wiped her hands and looked at the clock. She flipped the porch light on ahead of the timer just in case and nudged the front door open with her hip. I sat on the top step, the concrete still warm through my socks, and waited to hear tires on our street familiar tread on familiar gravel, children's voices carrying around the corner before the bus itself appeared. The light above us glowed steady and pale, catching the moths as they started their small circles. Somewhere in the neighborhood a phone rang once and stopped like someone had remembered they were calling too late. The air settled. The road stayed empty. And the porch light burned on. The night after the bus vanished into the fog, the porch light still burned. I remember it clearly because my mother forgot to switch it off before bed, and that never happened. She said it helped her sleep, but I knew it was worry that kept her up. The next morning, when I came down for breakfast, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of cold coffee. The radio turned low. There was a tone in the announcer's voice one I'd never heard before. It wasn't breaking news. It was something quieter, like hesitation wrapped in disbelief. He said a school bus from Hallstead Ridge Elementary was overdue from a field trip to Morning Lake. I didn't move at first. I just watched my mother's mouth tighten as she turned the dial down to silence. The first thing I remember after that was the sound of engines. Not the normal kind from our block, the deep, steady rumble of county trucks and patrol cars. By 9 that morning, the whole stretch of Morning Lake Road was lined with vehicles, their hazard lights blinking through the mist like a second sunrise. My mother wouldn't let me leave the porch, but I could see the sheriff's cruiser flash red against the pines. Back then, Sheriff Thomas still ran things thick glasses, slow, drawl a man who carried patience like a badge. I remember him walking door to door trying to keep his voice steady, while mothers cried into their dish towels and fathers stared at the pavement, unable to say a word. Everyone said it had to be a breakdown. Maybe the bus stalled. Maybe they took a wrong turn. But by noon, the weather had cleared, and there was still no sign of the children, no driver, no calls. Just an empty two-lane stretching toward a lake that suddenly didn't feel like part of home. That evening, they asked folks with pickup trucks to help haul volunteers and equipment out to the search sites. My father was one of them. I remember him standing in the doorway trying to find the right tone to promise me it would be fine. He didn't. He just said he'd be back after dark. When the phone rang at midnight and he hadn't returned, my mother's voice broke for the first time since I'd been sick. She called my aunt to come sit with me, but I couldn't sleep. I kept waiting to hear tires on the gravel, the thump of his boots on the porch, the door creak that always came before his sigh. Instead, it was silence, that thick kind that swallows every small sound until you think you've gone deaf. By dawn, the story had already reached the next county. Helicopters circled Morning Lake like flies around a carcass. I remember watching them from the road, the way their shadows slid across the treetops and disappeared into the fog that still hung close to the ground. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I walked to the end of our street anyway. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and gasoline, and every so often you'd hear a short burst of voices on radios, snatches of updates that didn't mean much out of context. The words "no contact" repeated again and again. By the second day, the whole town had changed. School shut down. The grocery store stayed open late to feed volunteers, and the post office started taking donations for gas and supplies. I didn't understand what a missing persons bulletin was then, but I remember seeing the first stack of flyers on the counter at Murphy's Hardware. Each one had the same picture printed across the top 30 faces, children and adults smiling against the backdrop of a bus window. At the bottom, it read, Hallstead Ridge Elementary, Morning Lake Field Trip, May 19th, 1986. My own classmates, their faces just as I remembered them, frozen in an image that already looked like history. The sheriff's department ran the search for 2 weeks straight. They combed every logging trail, every dirt turnoff, every abandoned cabin within 20 miles. They dragged the lake twice, sent divers down with weighted lines and spotlights that caught nothing but silt and cold fish scales. Some volunteers swore they saw tracks along the service road that matched bus tires, but they ended in soft mud like the earth had swallowed them whole. The school board held a meeting on the 15th day, and parents packed the gymnasium until the walls echoed with whispers. I sat outside with a handful of kids who were too young to be allowed in. We traded stories the way children do when fear is too big to name some. Said the bus went off a cliff. Others said a sinkhole opened beneath it. One boy swore his uncle saw lights in the woods the night before like a UFO. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the reflection of the gym lights on the blacktop and thought about Nora's red ribbon, how it caught the sun that morning as she waved from her seat. Eventually, the state declared it an unresolved vehicular disappearance. That was the official term they printed in the paper. No evidence of foul play, no wreckage, no bodies. The sheriff told everyone that sometimes nature keeps its secrets, especially in terrain like ours. Thick pine stands, old mining shafts, pockets of land that shift when the groundwater moves. People nodded because they wanted to believe him. But no one really did. For months afterward, families left porch lights on all night as if 15 children could somehow find their way back down a road they'd vanished on. Years passed, and the case turned into a story you didn't bring up at dinner. Folks moved away. Married, started new lives. Some stayed like me because the land had its hold and grief becomes easier to live with when it's shared. The bus route was changed. The lake was renamed a wildlife preserve. They even planted new trees along the service road, hoping to bury the scar the search had left behind. By the time I joined the sheriff's department in my 20s, the Morning Lake case was a dusty folder at the back of the records room. Every new deputy took one look at it, shook their head, and said what we all said. Nothing there but ghosts. For almost 4 decades, that was true. Until the morning my phone rang this past spring. I'd just poured my first cup of coffee when dispatch patched through a call from a construction crew digging near the old campgrounds. The foreman's voice crackled over the line, unsteady. He said they'd hit metal big curved yellow. I drove out without thinking. The closer I got, the more the landscape changed. The pines grew dense again, younger, but still crowding the road like witnesses that refused to forget. When I reached the site, heavy machinery sat idle, and a patch of raw earth opened in the middle of the clearing. I could smell the clay before I saw what was buried beneath it. The corner of a bus roof, faded and cracked like an old shell. The years hadn't been kind to it. The soil had pressed the frame inward, glass shattered and eaten by moss. The metal flaked under the weight of time. But even in that ruin, I could still see the shape that had haunted our town. The yellow wasn't gone completely. It clung to the ridges in dull streaks enough to catch light when the sun broke through the clouds. A construction worker stood beside me, his boots caked with mud. He said they hadn't touched the inside after realizing what they'd found. "It's all yours, Sheriff." I nodded, but for a long time I couldn't move. My hands were trembling, and I didn't want them to see. We opened the emergency exit first, just wide enough to let the air escape. It hit us like a wave, earthy, moldy sweet, in a way that only comes from long decay. I climbed inside with a flashlight. The seats were still bolted in their vinyl, peeling like old skin. Some of the seat belts were buckled. A pink lunchbox sat tipped on its side beneath the third row. On the back step, a small shoe lay half buried in moss. But there were no bones, no bodies, not even scraps of clothing, just emptiness. It was worse than finding remains. It was as if the bus had been packed away as a relic, a hollow monument to an event no one could remember clearly anymore. At the front, taped to the dashboard under a layer of grime, was a piece of lined paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Miss Delaney's, her looping cursive, the kind all teachers used then. It was a class list, 15 names written neatly. At the bottom, someone else had scrawled a message in red marker. The ink bled and blurred, but still legible. We never made it to Morning Lake. I don't know how long I stood there reading it. Maybe a minute. Maybe 10. Outside, the crew had gone quiet. The woods around us were still the kind of stillness that feels staged, like the world was holding its breath. I walked back out and told them to seal the area until the state team could arrive. Then I drove straight to the records building downtown, the same one I used to visit as a rookie. The smell hadn't changed. Mildew, old paper lemon cleaner fighting a losing battle. The clerk on duty recognized me and asked if it was true. I told him I didn't know yet. He brought out the archive box labeled Hallstead Ridge Elementary Field Trip 1986. It was heavier than I expected, the cardboard frayed around the edges. Inside were photocopies, missing posters, handwritten statements from the parents. At the very bottom was a stamped report dated 5 years after the disappearance, presumed lost, no evidence of foul play. I read it twice and then again. No evidence. No foul play. But there had been something else in the file: employment papers for the substitute driver, Carl Davis. Background check incomplete. Address listed as temporary residence. He'd disappeared too, never resurfaced anywhere under that name. Another form mentioned the substitute teacher, the one who had replaced Miss Delaney that day. M. Atwell, the same name from the clipboard I remembered as a child. No social security record, no forwarding address, no trace after that week. For nearly 40 years, those two names had sat in a box, unlooked at, unconnected. I set them side by side on the desk and felt the weight of something beginning to move after decades of stillness. I was halfway through scanning the files when Harris, one of my younger deputies, came through the door, pale as chalk. "Sheriff," he said, "breath-catching. You need to see this." I followed him down the hall to the hospital ward. A woman had been found near the construction site, barefoot, dehydrated, and disoriented. She kept saying she was 12 years old. The nurse handed me her intake form, and my heart stopped when I saw the name Nora Kelly. When I stepped into that hospital room, it felt like walking into a memory that had refused to fade. She was sitting upright on the bed, her hair long and tangled, her skin pale as candle wax. But it was her eyes that did it, bright green, still carrying that stubborn glint I'd seen through the bus window nearly 40 years earlier. I froze. She blinked, looked at me for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You got old," she whispered. I tried to speak, but my throat wouldn't work. When I finally managed a word, it was barely sound. "You remember me?" Nora nodded slowly. "You had chicken pox," she said, her voice breaking into a laugh that turned into a sob. "You were supposed to come too." I pulled the chair up beside her bed and sat down, my knees weak. "They told me no one would remember," she said after a long pause, "that no one would come." I asked who told her that. She looked past me out the window where the fog was rising off the morning field. Then she turned back and said the same words I'd seen written on that paper. "We never made it to Morning Lake." That night I returned to the station and pinned her name at the top of the old caseboard. Beneath it, I wrote one word in red: "Survived." Then I sat there in the quiet office, the hum of the fluorescent light above me, the rain ticking against the window, and tried to understand what had just happened. If Nora was alive, where had she been all this time? And more importantly, where were the others? I didn't know it yet, but that question would take me places I'd never wanted to go, and back into a part of this town that had been waiting patient as the lake itself for someone to start asking again. By the time I got back to the hospital, the sky had turned that washed-out gray that comes after a Texas rain, the kind that makes the pavement smell like pennies and cedar. I parked close to the side entrance where they kept the overnight patients and sat there for a while with the engine running. My hand rested on the steering wheel, but my mind was somewhere else, back in that bus in the smell of rot and dust and time. I kept seeing that note in my head. We never made it to Morning Lake. It didn't feel like a message written in 1986. It felt like something written yesterday. When I finally walked inside, Nora was sitting up in bed. Her hair still tangled, but her skin less gray than before. She looked small in that hospital gown, like a child wearing her mother's clothes. A nurse had braided part of her hair, and it made her look almost like the girl I remembered from our street, the one who'd once chalked hopscotch grids down the sidewalk in front of my house. When she saw me, she smiled faintly, that polite kind of smile people give when they're not sure if they should trust you yet. "You came back," she said quietly. "I told you I would," I said. I sat down, taking out the small recorder I'd started using for interviews. She didn't flinch, didn't ask what it was for. She just watched me like she'd been waiting years to finally tell someone what had happened. I asked her if she remembered the bus ride. She closed her eyes for a long moment, her lips barely moving as she spoke. "The morning felt strange," she said. "The air tasted like metal. Nobody was talking much, not even the boys in the back. The driver didn't look like our regular one. He was quiet. There was someone else waiting by the road, a man with a beard. He climbed on when we stopped at the fork." Her voice shook when she said that word, fork. I waited until she looked up again. "He told us the lake wasn't ready," she whispered. "He said we had to wait somewhere else first." Then, I don't remember much after that. Just waking up in a place that wasn't the camp. I asked what kind of place. She said it looked like a barn, but the windows were boarded from the inside. They told her it was a school, but no one was allowed to talk about before. Every time she said her voice dropped an octave, like she was afraid the word itself could summon something. She said there were 2 adults at first, a man and a woman. The woman disappeared after a while, got sick, Nora said. Then only the man remained. I asked if she remembered his name. She hesitated. "He called himself Mr. Avery," she said. "But later others called him something else. I'd heard that name before. The Avery family used to own land all over the northern ridge, old barns, broken campsites, an entire summer lodge that burned down sometime in the late 80s. I'd seen the name on foreclosure deeds when I was a rookie. It was a long shot, but it was something." Before I left that night, I showed Nora a copy of the old yearbook photo, 15 children bright-eyed and sunburned, all of them crowding around Miss Delaney's chair. Her hand trembled as she traced her finger over the image. "That's me," she said softly. "And that's Caleb and Kimmy." Then she stopped. Her eyes went glassy, her lips pressed tight. "They told us not to remember their names," she whispered. "They said names were dangerous." When I walked out of her room, the hallway lights flickered once. Hospitals always hum at night, that low electric sound mixed with the shuffle of nurses' shoes and the faint hiss of oxygen through vents. But as I stood there, something about the sound felt heavier, slower, like the building itself was holding its breath. Back at the office, I started digging. Property, records, missing persons, old tax ledgers, anything with the Avery name on it. The older files were on microfilm, and the machine clicked every few seconds as it scrolled. I found one listing from 1984, a transfer of an old summer camp on the north edge of the county. Riverview Youth Retreat, purchased by a family trust. The name on the signature line, Frank Avery. He'd died in 2003, but he had a son, Martin. Last known address unknown. It was nearly midnight when I drove out to what was left of the Avery property. The rain had started again, thin and cold, just enough to slick the road and bring the smell of pine sap out of the woods. The barn stood in the clearing like a skeleton leaning silent, half swallowed by weeds. The moonlight caught the edge of its rusted tin roof, and for a moment it looked like it was breathing. I stepped inside with my flashlight. The beam sliced through dust thick as fog. Old feed barrels lined the walls. A rope hung from a crossbeam frayed at the end. I walked toward the far corner where the dirt met the wall and something glinted near the ground. I knelt down and brushed it free. A small bracelet, plastic, faded purple with a name scratched in block letters. K-I-M-I. I sat there for a long time holding that little thing in my hand, remembering the girl who wore it. She'd been quiet, shy, the kind who drew cartoons on her math homework. I'd seen her mother once at the grocery store years after the disappearance. She never stopped carrying a photo of her daughter in her wallet, even when her hair went gray. When I got back to the station, I laid the bracelet on my desk beside the yearbook photo. I lined it up under Kimmy's face and just stared. That was when I called the state cold case unit and left a message about the Avery family and the newly discovered evidence. I didn't expect to hear back until morning, but I needed someone else to know what I'd found. Sleep wasn't possible that night. My office clock ticked loud enough to sound like footsteps. Around 2 a.m., I went back through the evidence from the bus. We'd finished a preliminary sweep that afternoon. No prints, no blood, just that single photograph tucked behind the paneling near the back window. I took it out of the bag and laid it under the desk lamp. 8 or 9 children standing in front of a low wooden building with boarded windows. Their faces were blank. I could name some of them: Caleb, Marcy, Kimmy, and right there in the middle, Nora. But the man standing in the doorway behind them was what froze me. He was tall, bearded, wearing a hat that shadowed most of his face. You could barely make out his eyes, but even in that blurred image there was something cold in his stance. On the back of the photo, someone had written 2 words in marker the chosen: Year 2. That meant they'd been held somewhere for at least 2 years. And whoever took that picture wanted to document it. The next morning, I brought the photo to Nora. When she saw it, she went pale. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes filled instantly. This was after the first winter, she said quietly. We had to pose once every season. He called it proof. I asked her if she remembered where the picture was taken. She shook her head. We weren't allowed outside without blindfolds, she said. But I remember sounds. A river close by and something that blew like a whistle at sunset. And the air, it smelled like burning pine. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew exactly what she was describing. Riverview Camp sat along a river bend, and for decades an old logging train used to pass through at dusk, blowing its whistle before crossing the bridge. That line had closed in '89, but the sound she remembered fit too perfectly to ignore. Later that evening, I drove north. The road to the old Riverview property was little more than a scar through the trees, gravel turning to dirt, turning to roots. The fog hung low again, the way it always did in that stretch of forest curling between the trunks like smoke that never learned how to rise. My headlights caught the corner of a wooden sign half-eaten by vines. Riverview Youth Retreat, private land. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out was the silence, not the quiet kind that comes at dusk, but an emptiness that pressed on your ears as if sound itself had been driven out of the place. I followed what was left of the old path, my boots sinking into soft ground. After about 50 yards, I saw the building from the photograph. Its roof sagged, the porch half collapsed, the walls blackened at the corners. The windows were boarded from the inside, just like Nora said. When I reached the steps, I froze. In the dirt below the porch were footprints, small, recent. A child's size, maybe a 6 or 7. My breath caught. I drew my flashlight and followed the prints a few feet before they vanished under the porch shadow. That was when I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost playful. "You're not supposed to be here." The sound came from inside the house. I felt my pulse in my throat, but I stepped forward, slow, careful. The door was cracked just enough to see a thin line of darkness inside. I pushed it open with the edge of my boot, and it gave way with a groan that seemed louder than it should have been. The air that came out smelled of dust mold and something metallic. I swept the beam across the room. Bare walls, broken furniture, and carvings, names scratched into the wood. Dozens of them. Some shallow, some deep, as if carved in anger or panic. I moved closer and traced one with my finger. Kimmy. Then another. Marcy. Beneath those, a cluster of words burned into the floorboards. Names we must not forget. In the corner, under a broken table, I found a metal box rusted nearly shut. Inside were papers and a small stack of Polaroids bound with a rubber band. The first few were of children sleeping, eating, crying. Each had a name written on the back, but not their real ones. Dove. Silence. Obedience. I flipped through until I reached the last one. It showed a little girl standing near a tree, her face turned away, but her arm visible, the purple bracelet bright even in the faded light. On the back was one word: disobeyed. Something creaked above me. I turned the flashlight toward the stairwell. Dust drifted down, catching the light like snow. Then came another sound. A voice, small, thin, but close. "You're not like them." The beam landed on a boy standing at the top of the stairs. Barefoot, pale, maybe 10 years old, hair hanging over his eyes. He didn't run. He just watched me. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. He tilted his head. "They called me Jonah," he said. "But that wasn't my name. Do you remember your real one?" He hesitated. "No. They took it. I told him he didn't have to be afraid, that I was here to help." He nodded barely. When I asked if he was alone, he pointed to the far wall behind the old bunks. I followed his gaze and saw more names burned into the wood, 12 of them. 3 circled, the rest crossed out. Beneath them, in black ink, someone had written, "We are still here." I brought Jonah back to the station that night. He barely spoke, but he didn't resist. When we pulled away from the property, he looked out the window at the trees sliding past, and in the faintest voice he asked, "Are the others coming too?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. He sat quietly in my back office while I fetched a blanket and some juice. The way he traced his fingers over the old yearbook photos, whispering the names Marcy, Sam, Kimmy, made something in me ache. He stopped at one photo, pointed to my own face as a child, and said, "You were supposed to come." It was after midnight when the forensics team radioed in from the bus site. They'd found something new hidden under a floor panel, a burned photograph. 4 children sitting around a campfire. On the back in marker it read, "He stayed. He chose to stay." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I thought about the list of names on my office wall, and one came to mind: Aaron Devlin. He'd been 11 in 1986, the oldest of the group, the one who always read mystery novels during recess. I checked the county database. There was an Aaron Devlin listed 49 years old, living quietly in a trailer park just outside of town. No high school record, no family, no trace before 1990. I turned off the desk lamp, grabbed my keys, and walked out into the cold. The woods around Morning Lake were silent again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt expectant, like something buried was starting to breathe. The road to the trailer park ran straight through the pine flats north of town, a 2-lane stretch that always looked the same, no matter the season. Same leaning mailboxes, same soft shoulder where the ditch water never quite dried. I drove it with the window cracked just enough to let in the smell of pine pitch and rain. By then, the sky had started to fall into that bruised color, between daylight and dark, the kind of light that makes everything look paused. The address from the county record turned out to be a single wide tucked behind a storage yard. There was one bulb above the porch, its glow pulsing in rhythm with the insects beating at it. When I knocked, it wasn't hesitation. I heard from inside it was preparation. Someone moving carefully, putting things in place. Then a man's voice, low but calm. I knew someone would come eventually. The door opened, and for a second I almost didn't recognize him. His hair had gone gray around the edges, but the eyes were the same soft brown I remembered from the school photos. Aaron Devlin, the oldest kid on that bus. He stood there for a long moment looking me over. "You're Sheriff Whitaker," he said quietly. "You used to wear your hair in braids, had a green backpack." I nodded, and he smiled, sad, almost relieved. Inside his place was tidy to the point of discomfort. Books stacked in perfect lines, a chessboard set out mid-game dust, nowhere to be found. He gestured toward the couch and sat opposite me. For a while, neither of us said anything. The rain had started up again, tapping against the aluminum siding, and that sound filled the space like static. When I asked why he never came forward, he rubbed his hands together slowly like he was trying to warm something that wasn't there. "Because not everyone wanted to leave," he said. "And because I wasn't sure if I had." He told me he'd stayed behind after the others tried to run, that he'd believed the man who led them believed they were being saved from a world that had already forgotten them. He called it a sanctuary. "We thought we were the lucky ones," he said. "We didn't understand what we'd lost until it was too late." His voice carried no bitterness, only exhaustion. When I asked who had built that sanctuary, he said it began with a man named Elijah, someone who called himself Father long before anyone asked him to. But after a fire year 4, he said the group splintered. Some of the kids escaped. Others were moved to different sites hidden under new names. I asked where those sites were, but he only shook his head. "Buried," he said. "But I can take you to where it started." We drove out before dawn, heading north toward the ridge. The forest changed as we climbed pines, giving way to older growth oaks twisted from decades of wind. Aaron sat in silence beside me, one hand clenched around the seatbelt strap. By the time we reached the clearing, the morning fog had thinned to a silver film over the grass. The place he led me to wasn't marked on any map, just a break in the tree line that opened onto a slope of blackened timber and stone. What remained of the original sanctuary leaned against the hill, its roof collapsed inward, vines creeping through the gaps. "This was it," he said quietly. "The first home." The word home didn't fit, not with the smell of ash still clinging to the ground. I followed him inside. The air was cold still, carrying a trace of smoke after all those years. Beneath a fallen beam, we found a row of small lockers, rusted but upright. Aaron knelt beside them and brushed away the dirt. "They made us keep what they gave us," he said. "One book, one spoon, one change of clothes. But some of us hid things anyway." He pried open the third locker with his hand and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a cracked cassette player, a child's bracelet, the same purple kind as Kimmy's, and a drawing folded into plastic. It showed a girl on a hill beneath a full moon holding a sign that read, "We are still here." Aaron's voice caught. Nora drew that the day before she ran. I didn't say anything. I just traced the edge of the paper, feeling the brittle texture where time had tried to erase it. "You said the others were moved," I asked. "Where?" He pointed toward the ridge behind the building. "They called it Haven," he said. "It was where they took the younger ones, the ones who didn't ask questions anymore." We hiked the ridge for nearly 2 hours. The air grew heavy, and the forest thickened until the light barely reached the ground. Finally, the path dropped into a small basin, and there it was a concrete structure built into the hillside, its door rusted but intact. Aaron's voice lowered. "This is where they watched us," he said. "Where they waited for us to forget." The word "waited" landed like a stone. We pried the door open with a jack from my truck. The air that escaped was cold and dry, the kind of cold that doesn't belong to weather. Inside, the walls were lined with metal bunks, names etched into the concrete, some scratched, others burned. In one corner, a crooked sign still hung above a smaller doorway. "The garden." I asked what that meant, but Aaron didn't answer right away. "It wasn't a garden," he said finally. "It was a place to listen." His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. "They told us the world couldn't find us if we forgot who we were, so they made us practice forgetting. We found a small tape recorder buried under the debris near the wall. The casing cracked, the label worn to nothing. When I turned it over, someone had carved a sentence into the plastic with what looked like a nail for the ones who remember. I took it back to the station, handed it to the tech team, and asked them to restore whatever was left. It took most of the night. By the time the audio was ready, the rain had turned to a steady rhythm against the windows. I sat alone in my office when I pressed play. Static at first, then a child's voice soft shaking. "This is Nora, I think. I don't know anymore. They say not to say our real names. That's how the world finds you." The tape hissed, and I heard breathing, a whisper that might have been another child in the background. "If anyone finds this," the voice continued, "don't believe them when they say we ran away. We didn't. We were taken." Then silence. When the next words came, they were faint, almost lost under the hum. "I'm not gone. Not yet." I sat there long after the tape clicked off. My hands were trembling. The voice wasn't Nora's. It was younger. And though it had aged, I knew that tone. It was Kimi Leong. I brought the recorder to Nora the next morning. When I played the tape, she closed her eyes, tears running down her face. "She was always the one who wanted proof," she said. "She told me if we ever got out, someone had to know we were real." Her hand pressed to her chest like she was holding something inside from breaking loose. "She's alive," she said finally. "I don't know how I know it, but she is." I didn't argue. The way the voice sounded on that tape, it wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise. Aaron showed up at the station later that afternoon with a map he'd drawn from memory. He pointed to a spot near the far end of the forest just beyond the second ridge. "There's a hatch," he said, "hidden under a tree that was split by lightning. We used it when they moved us between places." I asked how sure he was, and he met my eyes for the first time since we'd left Haven. "If it's still there," he said, "that's where they'll be." We drove out that evening. The light was fading fast, the trees closing in tight over the road. We parked near the old riverbed and hiked the rest on foot. It took nearly an hour before we found a cedar tree cleaved down the middle, its roots twisted around a patch of stone. Beneath the brush, hidden by years of growth, was a metal hatch fused with rust. The engraving at the edge was almost gone, but I could still make out the letters, TS2 Transfer Station 2. The metal groaned when we forced it open. Cold air poured out like the earth was sighing. We climbed down a narrow shaft into a tunnel lined with concrete. 10 rooms branched off the main corridor, each no bigger than a closet. Each filled with remnants of a life stopped mid-sentence. A child's drawing, a tin cup, a blanket turned to dust. The air was so still that even our breathing seemed too loud. At the center of the structure was a round room with 15 desks arranged in a perfect circle, each one with a nameplate. Some I recognized, some I didn't. A glass case stood in the middle. Inside was a black leather book. I broke the glass and opened it. Page after page of handwriting, different styles, different ages. The same phrases repeated again and again. Obedience is safety. Memory is danger. The past is infection. At the bottom of the last page, one name appeared over and over. Cassia. Then crossed out. Then written again. The final line read, "Cassia remembered. Room 6 is sealed." I radioed the search team to start scanning the walls for hollow space. It took hours, but when we found the false partition and broke through, the air that came out was thick with mildew and something faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. The beam of my flashlight hit the far wall, first photographs. Hundreds of them. Children standing in rows, kneeling, staring blankly into the camera. And in the center of the wall, painted by hand, was a mural of a girl running through the trees toward a shaft of light. Below it were the words, "Cassia remembered." She left the light on for us. I stood there until the others caught up. There are moments in this job that don't feel like discovery. They feel like being chosen to carry someone else's burden. That was one of them. Back in town, I pulled every state record I could find on post-collapse group homes from the early 90s. Dozens of unnamed children had been relocated across the country after unlicensed institutions were shut down. One file caught my attention. A girl, age unknown, found wandering near the California line, no memory of her name. She'd been given a temporary identity, later adopted by a couple in Morning Lake. Her new name was Maya Ellison. She ran the small bookstore downtown. I'd spoken to her countless times over the years, never once suspecting who she really was. The next morning, I walked into that bookstore. The bell over the door chimed soft and familiar. Maya was shelving a stack of used paperbacks, her hair pinned up loosely, glasses sliding down her nose. When she looked up and saw me, she smiled the way polite people do in small towns. I set a photograph on the counter, the mural from room 6, the girl running toward the light. She stared at it for a long time, her hands starting to shake. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "I used to dream about her." Her voice cracked. "I thought she was made up. I told her she wasn't. I told her that the girl in the mural was her, and for the first time since this case began, I watched someone's entire life shift in front of me, the confusion, the fear, and finally, the kind of understanding that hurts to accept." That evening, I brought Maya to the hospital. Kimi was there, weak but alive, her eyes bright with recognition the moment Maya stepped through the door. They didn't need introductions. They just looked at each other for a long time before Kimi whispered, "Cassia." And Maya answered Kimi. The sound that filled the room then wasn't crying. It was relief, deep and quiet. The kind that doesn't erase what happened but makes it bearable enough to keep breathing. I stayed until the nurses dimmed the lights. When I left, the moon hung over Morning Lake, and for the first time in my life, I saw its reflection not as a mirror, but as a door that had finally, after all these years, begun to open. The night the last piece of the case fell into place, I didn't feel the rush most people imagine comes with closure. It wasn't triumph or relief or even peace. It was quieter than that, an ache that settled behind the ribs and stayed there steady as a heartbeat. After almost 4 decades, we had found what was left of the Morning Lake children. Not just the ones who came home in flesh and bone, but the ones who lived on through stories whispered in the walls of those old camps, in tapes buried underground, in the drawings of a girl who refused to stop remembering. For weeks after Kimi and Maya were reunited, the hospital room became a kind of chapel. No prayers, no sermons, just the sound of 2 people relearning what it meant to exist in the same world again. They would sit together in silence for hours, holding hands like sisters separated by a lifetime. Some nights, Aaron would join them, sitting in the corner by the window, his face half in shadow, listening but never interrupting. He was the one who'd stayed behind the longest, and I think part of him still lived in that place, even as his body sat in that room with us. Nora came often, too. She brought small things, a sketch pad, a radio, a bag of oranges that reminded her of the camp summers she thought she'd lost. Watching them together felt like seeing ghosts learning how to breathe again. The investigation stretched for months. The state brought in forensic teams to excavate the site beneath the cedar tree. What they found were artifacts of a system that had buried itself to avoid being found: birth records, false identities, medical charts, and traces of other locations linked to the same network. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the Avery property wasn't just one man's crime. It was part of a larger sickness that had spread quietly across state lines, hidden behind names like sanctuary and home. Some of those involved were long dead. Others had slipped through the cracks, their paper trails erased, before anyone had learned what questions to ask. The man who called himself Father Elijah had died in 2001 under a different name in a nursing home 3 counties over. The caregivers said he spent his last years painting crosses on the walls of his room with rust-colored ink and muttering about the chosen. The news of his death didn't bring satisfaction to anyone. Justice delayed that long stops being justice. It becomes history, something to file, something to learn from, but never something that truly balances the scales. The district attorney's office reviewed what remained of the case, but most charges were impossible to bring. Too much time, too many missing records, too many people who'd already gone to their graves with the truth. What they did do was reopen dozens of missing children's files from the 1980s and 90s, comparing DNA samples, tracking down survivors who'd been given new identities. One by one, names began to surface again. Some matched those from the Morning Lake list. Others belonged to children taken from entirely different places, folded into the same broken system that called itself salvation. When the federal report came out a year later, it filled nearly 600 pages. It described a coordinated pattern of abduction, coercive indoctrination, and identity erasure across multiple facilities operating under religious exemption. Most people in town didn't read past the headline. For them, the story ended when the bus was found. For me, it never did. I kept reading until the last page, until I reached the section labeled Recovered Individuals. There were 5 names printed there, each marked as living. Nora Kelly, Kimi Leong, Aaron Devlin, Maya Ellison, and one listed as unidentified juvenile, alias Jonah. That boy, the one we found at the retreat, had been placed with a foster family in another county. He didn't talk much, but he drew trees, rivers, cabins, and a circle of faces standing under a pale sun. I kept in touch with all of them. Nora moved west and started teaching art at a community center, spending her weekends leading workshops for trauma survivors. Kimmy opened a small studio near the lake, painting scenes from memory, the kind of things most people would find too painful to look at, but she made them beautiful somehow. Aaron stayed close to town, helping us catalog evidence for the state archive. I think he wanted to make sure the record stayed straight, that the truth couldn't be bent again. Maya Cassia, as we learned to call her when the past fit back into her name, kept the bookstore. She said it was enough to surround herself with other people's stories for a while before writing her own. As for me, I stayed in the job long enough to see the memorial finished. It stands at the edge of Morning Lake now, a simple structure of cedar and glass with the names of the missing etched into the panels in the order they were taken. No sermon carved in stone, no grand dedication. Just a bench, a bell, and a line at the base that reads, "We remember their names, so the world can't take them again." The first time I visited, it was a cloudy afternoon in early spring. The lake was still that mirror-flat kind of still that makes you whisper even when you're alone. I walked the path around the water, stopping where the tree line met the shore. The fog hung low, curling around the surface like breath. For a moment, I could almost see the bus reflected there, the shimmer of its windows, the curve of its roof, and the shapes of the children waving from inside. I know it wasn't real, but I let myself stand there long enough to believe it could be. People sometimes ask why I stayed with the case all those years. I don't have a perfect answer. Maybe it was guilt, maybe duty, maybe both. I missed that trip because I was sick, and for years that small twist of fate sat on my chest like a stone. Every time I passed the lake, I'd count the seconds between the waves hitting the shore, wondering if those children had heard the same rhythm before they vanished. Now I know they did. And somehow, through all the years and all the silence, a few of them managed to keep that rhythm alive long enough to be found again. This case taught me something I didn't expect, that truth doesn't always save people, not in the way we hope it will. Sometimes it just lets them rest. It gives a name back to the lost and a little bit of light to the ones who survived. The rest of us, we carry it. We make sure it doesn't disappear into rumor or myth. We say their names out loud, not as ghosts, but as reminders of how fragile a life can be when no one's looking. There's a night sound out here near the lake that I've learned to live with. It's the wind through the reeds mixed with the faint hum of water against stone. Some say it's just air moving through hollow places. But when I hear it, I think of voices, children's voices caught somewhere between this world and whatever comes after. They're not crying or calling for help. They're just speaking the way memory speaks when it's been waiting too long to be heard. Sometimes I stand by the water's edge long after dark, my reflection mingling with the stars scattered across the surface. The bell by the memorial sways in the wind, low and steady, and I realize that what haunts a place isn't always the evil done there. Sometimes it's the kindness that came too late. Kimmy once told me that she doesn't dream about the tunnels anymore. She dreams of running barefoot through the woods, sunlight on her face, the sound of water nearby. I like to believe that's where the story really ends, in that moment of running, of breaking through into light. I still keep the purple bracelet in my desk drawer. It's faded now, brittle around the edges, but when I hold it, it feels like a heartbeat. It reminds me that survival isn't about what you escape. It's about what you decide to remember. Morning Lake is quiet these days. The pines have grown thick again, covering the scars where the ground was torn open. Kids fish from the dock on summer mornings. The air smells like rain and soil, and if you stay long enough, forgiveness. I don't know if evil ever really dies, but I do know it can't stand the light forever. And here finally there's light. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for numbers, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because memory is the only thing that outlives silence. And some stories deserve to keep breathing even when the people in them are finally at rest.